Good morning all. I would like you to welcome to yet another session of Dialogues of Humanities and Social Science Department of IIT Gandhinagar. Today, we are honored to have Karthik Kavale from Ahmedabad University. He is with School of Arts and Sciences and received his doctoral training at Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. He is currently working on a social history of regional road networks, regimes of circulation and rural development in southern Tamil Nadu in the 20th century. So, today's talk is about between exclusion and autonomy, the mobility, moorings, dialectic and the reconstitution of village communities in the Tamil countryside. So, I hereby welcome you all to the dialogue session. I welcome you, sir.
Yeah. So, thank you, everybody. Am I audible? Yeah. So, I'm going to present today a chapter from my doctoral work. It's titled Between Exclusion and Autonomy. And I think I'll, as we go into the paper, I'll be able to explain why I chose that title. What I'm going to do today is to sort of give you a very brief description of the case study. It's a study of 2 revenue villages in southern Tamil Nadu. And I'll give you a brief description of the villages and the arguments that have been made about these villages and what my response to it is, what my counter arguments are. And then I'll sort of focus on the theoretical propositions I'm developing on the basis of this case study. My fear is that because I'm going to sort of do the case study quite shortly, in a very brief way, I might miss on some details that are necessary for the argument to be understood. So if you feel that I'm skipping over something that doesn't make sense, then feel free to just like interrupt me in the middle. So the first part, I'll focus on the case, and then the second half of the presentation, I'll sort of develop my theoretical propositions and conclude with that. Generally speaking, many explanations. So this, I'm going to begin with sort of a puzzle, which is why in some cases has Dalit assertion been more successful than others, right? So generally speaking, many explanations of Dalit social mobility tend to focus on the relationship between migration and social change in the countryside. So if you think of Ambedkar's critique of caste, he sort of argued that the Indian village was the locus of caste-based suffering, and for Dalits to progress, they will have to sort of escape the village in order to remove themselves from the sort of disabilities that living in a village tend to force upon them. So that's a pretty strong idea in the literature, that for Dalits to be socially mobile, they're going to have to leave the village and go somewhere else. And typically that's the city, right? The city is seen as a place of anonymity, a place where Dalits have relatively greater freedom, whereas the village is seen as the locus of caste-based suffering. And it's an idea that has kind of permeated the social sciences in general. So if you think of economists like Kaivan Munshi, he has argued that whereas caste-based insurance networks in rural areas keep a large number of villagers from permanently migrating to the city, Dalits do not have these insurance networks. Their networks are not strong enough for them to be sort of retained in the village. So they have no choice but to leave. And even among those who talk about migration more in terms of circular migration, the idea, so people like Vinay Gidwani tend to argue that circular migration enables Dalit assertion in the countryside because people who return, the migrants who return back to the village, they introduce new styles of consumption, they sort of resist traditional modes of labor deployment and so on, right? So and this is an idea that's quite popular among historians also. If you think of David Washbrook's sort of famous article called The Golden Age of the Pariah, he argued that since in the 18th century there was a high demand for landless laborers, and they were able to desert oppressive employment conditions in the sort of existing system. They were able to migrate freely. They had a relatively higher standard of living than subsequently in the 19th century, when the colonial state tries to curtail labor mobility in the first half of the 19th century. So in all of this literature, I mean, spanning centuries, the idea has, I mean, it's become quite common to suggest that for Dalits, especially for Dalits, and this is kind of true for other marginalized groups as well, the extent of social mobility becomes the index by which the fortunes of marginalized groups can be evaluated. So the more spatially mobile they are, the more likely they are to be socially mobile. So that's a fairly fundamental assumption in many different disciplines in South Asian studies. There's a parallel sort of assumption that tends to get made along these lines, which is that many of the transformations that are occurring in the countryside have made the village community less relevant for our understanding of agrarian class relations. If you think of Dipankar Gupta, who wrote this article about Wither, it's titled Wither the Indian Village, he argues that declining profitability in agriculture, the growing share of non-farm rural, the non-farm sector in the rural economy, as well as the migration patterns of most rural residents, all of these point to the gradual demise of the Indian village as we know it. And Han Bremen, in the context of South Gujarat, has argued that circular migrants, when they return to the contemporary village, the place where they live is little more than a rural slum, lacking in the strong community ties that are supposed to characterize the stereotypical Indian village. What remains in the Indian village is a capitalist landowning class capable of moving easily between rural and urban settings, and an equally footloose rural proletariat migrating from place to place in search of increasingly scarce and insecure work. So what is interesting here is that both the optimists who think that Dalits migrating have that's the only way for them to be socially mobile, and the pessimists who think that migration doesn't lead to any great outcomes, both of them sort of assume that the village community is necessarily on the decline, that migration necessarily implies that the village community is no longer a relevant category in South Asian studies. So, so the net result of all of this is that whereas many scholars sought to demonstrate that Dalit cosmopolitans use their access to the outside world to resist local forms of exploitation, it's very rare for us to see any literature where claims of rootedness are central to Dalit political repertoire. That rootedness in the village is a central element of Dalit politics. So this is not seen as something that's very likely to happen. So the two village studies that I'm going to describe, in my opinion, they contest this sort of very deep-rooted assumption. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a background about the place, the part of the part of Tamil Nadu that I did my research on. So this is a map of Tamil Nadu. It's the district map. So if you see the southernmost part of Tamil Nadu, you have two districts, Tirunelveli and Thoothukudi. So the two villages that I studied, they're about 20-25 kilometers away from Tirunelveli town, which is the biggest city in southern India, in southern Tamil Nadu. And they are basically on the border of the two districts. They're in the border of Thoothukudi and Tirunelveli. So this is just a sort of location map. And the units that I'm studying, that I'm focusing on, are what are called revenue villages. These are this is the smallest administrative category in the sort of district administration in most parts of India. So there's the revenue village, and I mean, we need to make a clear distinction between the revenue village, the panchayat village, and the social village. These are very different categories. The revenue village is an administrative category. The panchayat village is a category for local government. That's the unit for which panchayat elections are held. But the social village typically is something else. So in the context of these two revenue villages, this is just a zoomed in map of the same place. What you see is that there are several settlements. Now, as things stand today, most of these settlements consider themselves to be independent villages, right? Though for the purposes of local government and for the purpose of administration, they tend to be clubbed together to form a larger unit. So, for instance, on the right-hand side, you have this village called Shanmugapuram to the top. That's the name that I've given it to protect the privacy of my respondents. And just south of it is Chidambarapuram. These two come together in a single panchayat village and also in a single revenue village. By contrast, everything to the left comes under the Gangaikondan revenue village. So these are two different revenue villages, but when you think of sort of the social, what is socially understood as the village, these are generally seen as independent villages. So now, why did I choose these two villages, right? These two revenue villages. Part of it, of course, is that these are places where Dalit assertion has been remarkably successful. So if that's the phenomenon I want to explain, then these are places where the phenomenon I seek to explain has in fact occurred. So the Dalits who live in these villages are predominantly of the Pallar caste. In Tamil Nadu, there are three broad groupings of Dalits: the Parayars, the Pallars, and the Arundhatiyars. Of the three, the Pallars have been most successful in terms of getting access to, taking advantage of reservations, or with education, or even in business and so on. So generally, Pallars have been more socially mobile than the other two castes. And these two villages are not any exception. They're sort of reflecting the general rule that Pallars have been generally more socially mobile. But that's of course one reason. But the other reason is that these two revenue villages they've been studied repeatedly over the past 100 years. Not both of them, but Gangaikondan in particular is one of the so-called Slater villages, which is, so Gilbert Slater, who was a professor of economics at Madras University in 1915, he joined in 1915. He, for the first time in India, began this tradition of going and studying villages in some detail, right? He chose a few villages and sent his students to go and study them in detail. So for these particular villages, we have a remarkable archive with a lot of data about social relations as they existed at different moments in time. So Gangaikondan has been continuously restudied at a 20-30 year interval. The last study of Gangaikondan was in 2008. It got published in 2012. John Harris with Jayaranjan and R. Nagraj, they published this, the restudy of Gangaikondan in 2012 in Review of Agrarian Studies. So we have a lot of data on Gangaikondan. And what's very unusual is that the neighboring village Shanmugapuram also has a lot of data about it, because it was chosen for the village monograph studies that were conducted by the Census of India in 1961 and 1971. So I don't know, it was not studied in 71, but we do have the study for 1961. And so that's another source of data. And that village was again restudied by K.A. Manikumar in 2001. And as part of my research, I went and did fieldwork in Shanmugapuram. So the advantage of studying these two villages in particular is that they just have a remarkable archive going back 100 years. And in fact, there's some data further back as well, because what I was able to access was the village level data of the 1871 census. So I have data for 1871, I have data for 1916, and for several years after that. Now, I'm just going to make another point. The other point that needs to be clarified is the relationship between Gangaikondan and Shanmugapuram. Like why study these two villages? What's interesting is that Shanmugapuram is a Dalit majority village, in the sense that most of its population at all times in history have been of the Pallar caste. By contrast, Gangaikondan has always been a multi-caste village. It has settlements of multiple castes, including the Tevars, who are intermediate caste, and Brahmins, who are the upper caste, and some of the sort of mercantile castes as well. And as I'll show, in the early parts of the 20th century, Shanmugapuram was basically just yet another Dalit settlement which was providing labor for the landlords of Gangaikondan, who were predominantly Brahmins. So what we have are these two villages where Dalits, who were previously landless laborers, they were providing labor for Brahmin landlords. They have turned themselves into landowners, smallholders, but nevertheless independent cultivators, right? And what I'm trying to sort of understand is the process that enabled this transformation. So, like with many Pallar communities, Harris and Jayaranjan and Nagraj also find that these Pallars have established a kind of rough equality with the other castes, in the sense that if you go today to a Tevar neighborhood in Gangaikondan, a Tevar settlement in Gangaikondan, and a Pallar settlement in Gangaikondan, you're not going to find too many differences in terms of education levels, in terms of land ownership, in terms of the infrastructure that's available, in terms of water supply, and so on. On most of these fundamental concerns of any settlement, there's a rough equality. Of course, I mean, on average, Dalits might be slightly less likely to get educated. So there might be some variation, but on average, there's a kind of rough equality. In fact, especially with education, it's quite likely that the Pallars are more likely to be educated because they've had access to missionary education. This is another point that I'm going to get to. So I'm just going to sort of briefly list out the explanations that have been given in the literature for these two villages. I mean, the advantage of choosing these two villages is that they've already been written about. So people like John Harris have tried to explain this phenomenon that I'm concerned with. So the first explanation is that this was a Brahman village. Gangaikondan was a Brahman-dominated village, in the sense that a few Brahman households owned most of the land. It came under the so-called Mirasidari tenure. But in the early 20th century, most Brahmins in Tamil Nadu, across Tamil Nadu, sort of began leaving the countryside and taking up professional employment in the cities. And so there was an exodus of Brahmins beginning in the 20th century, but particularly picking up pace in the 1950s. And so one argument that's been made is that when Brahmins left, they opened up a space for Dalits to assert their sort of role in local political economy. That the departure of Brahmins allowed Dalits to kind of take charge of the resources of that village. So that's an argument that's been made. The other argument is that Dalits in this part of the country have long participated in circuits of migration, both permanent and circular migration. And in the early part of the 20th century, the destinations were either in the Western Ghats in India or in Ceylon, in Malaya, in Burma, and so on, right? So in Southeast Asia, broadly speaking. So this opportunity, this sort of spatial mobility that they enjoyed in the early 20th century, the argument goes, is the incomes that they earned from plantation work, many of them were able to come and reinvest in local resources, in the purchase of land in particular. And the third argument is that Tirunelveli was, it has historically been the target of a lot of missionary activity. The Pallar communities in these two villages were exposed to missionary education as early as the first decade of the 20th century. And so this long experience with education, with missionary education, has given them the resources to sort of take up professional employment in the form of salaried employment in the form of teachers, clerks, postmen, and so on. Right? So now what's interesting about all of these is that they're generally mobility-centric explanations. The explanation for Dalits being socially mobile is either Dalits themselves being spatially mobile or somebody else being spatially mobile, right? The Brahmins being spatially mobile. What is missing? Okay, I'm just going to sort of go to the next village as well. So if you look at the evidence for, so till now I was talking about Gangaikondan. Now quickly turning to Shanmugapuram, which is a Dalit majority village. And this was studied in 1961. There also the story as narrated by the people who did the study seems to focus largely on spatial mobility, right? So it says that in 1961, people, until 25 years back, which is until the 1940s, most of the land was owned by the absentee landlords of Gangaikondan, which are the Brahmins. Now, in the course of these past 25 years, Pallars of a particular sect have bought up these lands because the landlords of Gangaikondan figured out that they were not getting their rent payments on time, and it was just easier to sell it off. Right? So these are people who have already left for the city, or they're on the verge of leaving. Their children are studying, they're likely to get professional employment, so their sort of need to live in the village has diminished. And so they figure that it's better to just sell it off and move to the city entirely. And where did the money for buying up this land come from? The argument goes that most of the people who had gone to their estates had managed to save some money, and that's what they used to buy up the land. Now, what I'm doing in this chapter is contesting this narrative, which has been provided by many of the people who studied this village, based on some of the data that they themselves have provided. So the first is, there are three big problems with the explanations that have been provided. The first is that they tend to sort of elevate this figure of the heroic migrant, right? The heroic migrant who goes somewhere else, gets exposed to new ideas, or earns a little bit of money and comes back and then changes social relations in the village. But these are individual actors. What is missing is a clear account of how collectively the Pallars mobilized to take control of land, right, of the resources in the village. The second problem is with chronology, right? As the previous quote suggested, most of the transfer of land actually happens not in the early part of the 20th century, but later, after the 1940s, and particularly in the 1950s. That's when most of the land is being transferred. But if you look at the number of migrants to the plantations in both within India and elsewhere, we find that most of the migration was happening, in fact, in the early part of the 20th century. That's when the British Empire was at its peak. That's when restrictions on migration were at the lowest, right? And as Sunil Amrit has shown, when the Second World War breaks out, there was a sharp reduction in the possibility of Tamil workers migrating either to Southeast Asia or to Ceylon. After 1937, it becomes almost impossible. The numbers fall, the number of migrants falls sharply. So there's a chronological problem. If migration was the explanation for social mobility, then you would expect most of the social mobility to be happening when those a lot of migration, but that's not what we find. Now, it could be that in the 1950s, a lot of people are returning, right? And they're being forced to return, and because they're being forced to return, they're coming in and investing. But there again, you run into the first problem, which is that the number of, as the census study data shows, the number of people who return is actually pretty small. Most of the people who migrate for a long time tend to stay. There were, of course, circular migrants, but the data that I found, my analysis of the data suggested that the circular migrants, in fact, did not come with a lot of savings. The third problem, it's a related problem, is that in fact, you can argue that people continue to migrate within India, that the plantations within India were still available for people in the village to migrate to. But most of the wage data on plantation wages in India suggests that, especially in the Nilgiris and in Wayanad and so on, there was a steep decline in real wages between sort of the early decades of the 20th century to the middle decades of the 20th century, such that by the middle decades, in fact, wages in plantations were sometimes lower than wages for manual workers in the countryside, in the Tamil countryside. So it's not clear why this would be happening in the 1950s rather than earlier. And finally, there's a problem with respect to these explanations, that they don't explain the specificity of the part of Tamil Nadu where this is happening, right? Most of the data on migration to plantations suggests that Tirunelveli was not, in fact, the biggest recruiting ground for migrants. Tirunelveli was, it came below places like Salem, places like Trichy, Trichinopoly. These were the districts, and Tanjore. These were the districts where most Dalits were migrating. And if you compare village studies across sort of Tamil Nadu, different village studies. I mean, there's a strong tradition of village studies in Tamil Nadu, and I compared some of the other villages. You find that the places where there was a lot of migration, in fact, are not places where Dalit social mobility has been particularly high. So all of this poses a problem for this explanation. So what is the alternative explanation that I'm providing? Now, unfortunately, for my alternative explanation, I have to rely much more on the oral histories that I collected. My argument is based on 36 very long interviews in one settlement, which is Shanmugapuram. So I basically try to talk to the older people in the village and get a sense of how they got hold of land. And oral histories are notorious for being somewhat unreliable. So memories are always colored by what's happening right now. But I was able to sort of come up with at least a hypothesis based on a few sort of stories that were told to me. What is suggested is that around the 1940s, but particularly after independence in the 1950s, there's a sudden emergence of anti-landlord mobilization in this part, not just in these two villages, but also elsewhere. So the Communist Party becomes pretty strong for just about 15 years. And during that period, what they're doing is they're mobilizing peasants against landlords across the district, right? Pallars, their own narrative suggests that they were part of this movement against the landlords. But this was not a movement for land reform as we understand it. This was, in fact, a movement, and it was not an organized movement. I didn't find any evidence of like one organized movement, but rather many sort of sporadic incidents. These were villagers saying that the land in their village belongs to, in the sense that they have the first right to cultivate the land in their village. Now, I'm emphasizing in their village because it's extremely important to think about what they mean by their village. And I'm going to suggest that what they meant by their village changed during these decades. But the first step was to suggest that they insisted that if there was a landlord who owned land in their village, he or she was required to lease it out to somebody within the village. So previously, if there was, most of these tenants were under the so-called varamdari system, which meant that varam tenure meant that the tenant had to pay 2/3 of the total produce, not pay, but sort of hand over 2/3 of the produce to the landlord. It was a sharecropping system. Every year, the landlord was free to change the tenant, right? This is there in the reports. I'm getting this from the reports on Gangaikondan. What my my interview respondents, and I was talking to really old people, what they were suggesting is that around the 1940s, they started insisting that the replacement tenant, suppose the landlord is unhappy with one tenant, he has to choose somebody from within the village. There were some incidents when landlords, either located in Gangaikondan or elsewhere, tried in Shanmugapuram, they tried to bring in tenants from a different village who were not Pallars. And at that time, the Pallars of the village came together and threatened violent action. And they were able to convince the police and the district administration, in the interest of peace, to support the demand. Now, there is no sort of legal intervention here. All they're insisting is that the landlord can only lease out his land to somebody from within the village. And the district administration and the police were, at that moment, willing to go along with this demand. This is sort of one episode that I had a very clear narration of. And in that particular incident, what happens is that the landlord then gives up, he's very frustrated, and he sells it to somebody else. And that person then decides to sell it to the person who is cultivating on easy terms, right? So basically, he would say, for 10 years, continue to pay me whatever you've been paying me so far, and at the end of that period, you get hold of the land. So the census study also suggests that this was how many of the villagers were getting hold of the land. Yeah.
So, how is it that the Pallars ended up being able to negotiate that they get to be the tenants?
Mm-hmm.
And what was the role of the other subordinated castes, and why is it that they didn't, or they weren't being able to stake this kind of a claim?
Well,
is that because the Communist Party that was behind some of this mobilization ended up sort of working with the Pallars alone, or what happened to the other castes?
So the Communist Party was in fact mobilizing both the Tevars and the Pallars.
So then how did the Pallars sort of come at the forefront of this?
Why did the police and the district administration side with them?
I think around this time there were a lot of violent incidents, and I mean, if we know, this is true even today, that the first job of the collector is to maintain peace. My hunch, I mean, this is just hunch, because now I'm operating on, I'm using oral history. So some of these questions I don't have a clear answer to, but my hunch.
Also look at the district records and talk to any of the people who were posted at that time to find out whether.
Well, it would be very hard for me to locate definitely the district collectors at that time, because they're most likely dead. Also, people who are working there, again, people who are in the district administration must have been older at the time, so they would not be alive. So what I'm relying on for these is actually historical narratives of other incidents that have been published in some dissertations. But this particular incident, I only have the contours of what was happening inside that village. Why the district administration chose to support their claim is not something that I can clearly
It could
answer.
also be because they're just numerically much more dominant, and that could
In
be
that particular
in
village.
that village.
Right.
I mean, that could be a very plausible explanation. You had a substantial numerical, presence of this particular group, and that does maybe help.
Yeah, but again, we need to ask, why did that not happen before, right?
Right.
So there's something happening in the 40s and 50s, and I mean, obviously it's got to do with electoral democracy, and that's where the numbers come in, that now the collector is answerable to a chief minister who's elected, and yeah.
The Communist Party as well, the mobilization that was
Right.
happening had also something.
Yeah, I'm sure it had something to do with it, but I can't say, I can't comment on that with too much confidence beyond, I mean, there's a level of speculation here. The other thing that is very clear is that they were now redefining what the village is. So until the early 20th century, by village, what was meant was the Brahman, sort of the Agraharam and all of its sort of surrounding settlements that were in service of the Agraharam. All of that put together was the Mirasi village. It's very clear, and the names were, so if you go to the map, the names make it very obvious that that's how they were thought of. The Dalit village nearest to Gangai Kondan was called Anaitalai Pacheri. Pacheri means Dalit settlement, and specifically it means a Pallar settlement. Parayar settlement would be called a Paracheri. So you have Anaitalai Pacheri, Pungan Pacheri, Turayur Pacheri, right? So these places were explicitly named as sort of settlements in service of the Agraharam. Now, what happens in the 40s and 50s, and this I have oral historical narratives that talk about this, is that the names, they explicitly change the names. Anaitalai Pacheri becomes Anaitalayur, Pungan Pacheri becomes Punganur, Turayur, of course, was, they just dropped the Pacheri. So they're now redefining themselves as villages in their own right. Now, it has always been the case that Dalit settlements had some autonomy over the residential area of the settlement. This has always been the case. But what changed is that now they also claim some degree of autonomy over the surrounding land. So in the case of Shanmugapuram, for instance, they claim basically all of the land to the east, which is fed by this irrigation tank to the north. It's called Parakrama Pandyan tank. Now, so they basically claim, and they've already been cultivating that land. They are the best suited to cultivate that land, even though it's in the next revenue village, because for the people of Anaitalayur to cultivate it, they would have to cross the river. So Shanmugapuram was nearer, there were fewer barriers. They've always been cultivating that land. Now they claim that that land is in fact a part of their village. And that, I mean, in my view, is a fairly important development, because that's how they're able to sort of insist that this is our village, and so the land within our village will be cultivated by us. So now the third part of it, of course, is the political representation, right? Without political representation, none of this would have been possible. So what's happening in the 1950s is that Tevars in the 40s and 50s, Tevars, who are the intermediate caste, they leave the Congress fold and start a new, they join the Forward Bloc, in fact, Subhash Bose's party. And the leader is this guy called, the name is escaping me right now. So Muthuramalinga Tevar, right? So Muthuramalinga Tevar leaves the Congress fold and joins the Forward Bloc. The Congress then basically comes under the Congress in Tamil Nadu becomes K. Kamraj's sort of political machine. And Kamraj is a nadar. He belongs to a kind of mercantile caste, a sort of newly emerging mercantile caste. And the nadars and the tevars have been historically at odds with each other. This is like a 200-year-old feud between the nadars and the tevars. So Kamraj very sort of actively cultivates the support of the Pallars, right, to sort of build a political coalition that is likely to bring him back into power multiple times. And that is how Pallars get sort of direct access to political power. The MLA from Gangaikondan is a Congress MLA. It happens to be a reserved seat, so it's actually a Pallar. Sorry, and the MP is it's a reserved seat, so the MP belongs to the same caste. And in Kamraj's government, the PWD minister is somebody called Pusari Kakkan. So P. Kakkan and he's also Dalit. So they have, through these sort of mechanisms, they have direct access. This is what the oral histories are suggesting, that they have direct access to state power. And that seems to be how they ensured that they're able to keep control over the land. And also because the PWD minister was somebody belonging to their caste, they were also able to ensure that the irrigation tank was renovated and they got direct access to the water from the irrigation tank. So, I mean, this is just the sort of case study. How am I doing on time?
Yes, you have about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Maybe some time for the question and
Right. So I'll try to go through my sort of theoretical arguments based on this case study. The first, of course, is that an explanation for social mobility that's purely based on spatial mobility, I don't think is going to be is sufficient for any case. And what I'm arguing is that we need to complement our analysis of spatial mobility with the analysis of spatial moorings. By mobility, I mean the freedom, the capability to move. By moorings, I mean the capability to stay put, right? So Dalits were socially mobile, not just because they were able to move, but because of place-based mobilization, they won the right to stay put in the village. Now, by mobilities and moorings, I'm talking about social relations. They should not be confused with circulation and fixity. Somebody can be, a bonded laborer may be asked to move from place to place at the behest of the owner. That person is forced to circulate, but he or she has no mobility of their own. By contrast, somebody who's living in the same village their entire life may have the resources, the ability to move at any point, right? I would call them sort of more mobile than the person who's actually moving around a lot. The same is true with fixity. So if you think of Dalits in the 19th century in places like Gangaikondan, they were fixed in the sense that they did not have the freedom to move very much in the early 19th century. But they had no moorings to speak of either, in the sense that they had their livelihood in the village was dependent on somebody else's decision, right? So they had no access to livelihood in the village on their own terms. So in that sense, they did not have very much by way of moorings. And I call it a sort of state of permanent unmooring that Dalits experienced before sort of the 20th century. So if we need to explain the trajectory of Dalit social mobility, we need to talk about spatial mobilities that they begin to enjoy after a certain point in history, but also we need to talk about their spatial moorings. That is sort of proposition one. The second is that mobilities and moorings are not always mutually reinforcing. There are historical moments when communities are unmoored at the same time that they become exceptionally spatially mobile, right? The classical example is primitive accumulation in the Marxian sense. So primitive accumulation can be thought about as mobility plus unmooring for the peasant, right? The peasant is mobile suddenly. They're not tied to land anymore, but they're unmoored. They no longer have this is what Marx sarcastically calls double freedom, right? It's the freedom to go anywhere to work, but also the freedom from anything that holds you back in the village. So it's sarcastic, but so primitive accumulation can be thought of as mobility plus unmooring. Now, what I'm suggesting here is that the vice versa is also possible. You can have historical junctures where communities find their mobilities being curtailed, but their moorings being enhanced. And I suggest that the 1950s for the Dalits of Gangaikondan are just such a moment when, because of these national boundaries becoming very rigid, they're no longer able to travel to Malaya, they're no longer able to travel to Ceylon with as much ease, but within their village, their moorings are significantly enhanced. My third sort of proposition is that even when mobilities and moorings are mutually reinforcing, and there are, of course, certain historical moments when they mutually reinforce each other, it's still sort of problematic to think of them as mutually substitutable. Which is to say, suppose you think about people in the village today and how they build new housing. Okay, in Shanmugapuram today, during the period of my fieldwork, much of the new housing was being built in the land that is technically part of the village commons. Now, the people who are building these new houses, many of them did have incomes from elsewhere. They're migrating, they're earning incomes, they're coming back and building houses. So there is, of course, these moorings are being used, these mobilities are being used to reinforce moorings. But without being members of the village community to begin with, they would not be able to get permission from the panchayat president to use the Purambok land. Purambok is the village commons. They would not be able to get permission to use the village commons to build their house, right? So being a member of the village community, being moored in the village community is in some sense a prerequisite for being able to take advantage of the moorings that you do enjoy. And the two are not substitutable. You can't, the mutually reinforcing nature of mobilities and moorings at the present historical juncture cannot be reproduced if you had a household that did not have any moorings in the village to begin with. My fourth proposition, and I think I'll sort of quickly end after this. So all of this leads me to suggest that we need to think about mobilities and moorings as sort of in some kind of dialectical relationship, which is to say that they're part of a larger totality and they can be only made sense of with respect to each other. Now, that itself is not very controversial. It's well within the Marxist framework. But what I'm further arguing is that the conventional Marxist way of thinking about mobilities and moorings are somewhat inadequate. So my reference point here is Henry Lefebvre, who is the sort of great spatial Marxist of the 20th century. And his spatial dialectics, if I put them, if I translate his arguments in using the concepts that I have used, suggest that the contradictions between mobilities and moorings are basically resolved by translating all moorings into capital, right? So suppose you have a house, that's a form of mooring, and capitalist development requires that labor should be free, the mobility of labor should be maximized, right? That's what capitalism requires according to sort of the conventional Marxist theory. So the contradiction then is resolved. I mean, labor needs to be mobile, but labor also needs moorings to reproduce itself. So the contradiction is basically resolved by saying that the moorings that you need to reproduce yourself as labor are forms of capital. So your house then takes the form of capital, and as capital, its value can circulate in global capital markets. And so even though that particular household may be fixed in space, the moorings that they enjoy are set free, in a sense, from all spatial barriers that confine that value to a particular point in space are obliterated, right? So that's how in Lefebvrean spatial dialectics the contradiction is resolved. What I'm suggesting is that that's not adequate. So what I'm suggesting is that in village communities in India today, moorings in fact do not translate into capital. At least not the way Marxists conventionally understand capital. And that is because the ability to enjoy these moorings, the ability to benefit from these moorings is conditional on membership in the village community. And because it is conditional on some on a criteria that is not internal to capital, capital in the sense the village community is produced not it's not constantly restructured by capital according to its own logic, but rather it is restructured. It is the product of the coexistence of capitalist and non-capitalist modes of production of space. That's kind of my response to the Lefebvrean tradition of spatial dialectics. And I'm sort of using examples from the case study that I just described to highlight that we need to think about mobilities and moorings in ways that do not sort of treat moorings as just something that's substitutable, right? You travel, you earn some money, you come back and you're free to acquire moorings that you did not have previously. That's not how village communities actually work. Rather, what we have is the reconstitution, the constant reconstitution of village communities through a complex coexistence of capitalist and non-capitalist modes of production. So yeah, I think I'll end there and open it up.